Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. For the last few videos, we've been in Unit 4 for AP World History, and we've been considering how maritime empires were established from 1450 to 1750. In this video, we're going to look at the kind of influence these empires had in Africa and in Asia. And then we're going to look at the kind of European rivalries that spurred this imperial expansion on. And finally, we're going to look at the labor systems that kept this whole imperial expansion machine running. Let's get to it. So first, let's consider the kind of responses that Africa and Asia had to this imperial expansion. As I've mentioned before, it was the Portuguese who were the first to establish an empire in Africa, but it's not the kind of empire we were used to. It was called a trading post empire. And by setting up ports of trade at strategic locations along the African coast, the Portuguese grew exceedingly rich by controlling trade. And these trading posts were usually established in cooperation with the local African leaders. And once they arrived, the Portuguese often traded with the African leaders, giving them gunpowder weapons in exchange for enslaved peoples. And once some of these African leaders had guns, it gave them the supreme advantage over all their neighboring tribes who did not have guns. And all things being equal, he with the guns usually wins. Now we can see that at least some of the African people were open to influence from the Europeans. In fact, some of these African states grew exceedingly wealthy by trading enslaved people to the Portuguese. But not only were these African states benefiting from economic growth, they also engaged in some cultural borrowing from the Europeans as well. For example, in the Kingdom of the Congo, King Alfonso I converted to Christianity, and you could see Christian influence in the art coming out of the Kingdom of the Congo as well. Now, let me stop here and address a potential complaint. Now, I've made videos before in which I've mentioned the cooperation that African leaders gave to the Europeans in their exchange of enslaved people. And for those comments, I've been called a blue-eyed demon who's whitewashing the horrors of slavery. But you can't ignore the evidence that some African states raided other African states in order to get enslaved people to sell to the Europeans. It just happened. So by acknowledging that reality, let me be clear on a few things I'm not saying. Things Heimler is not saying: number one, slavery is good. Things Heimler is not saying: number two, enslaved people were happy to be enslaved. So if you're gonna insult me in the comments, that's fine by me, I can handle it, but at least insult me for the things I'm saying and not for the things I'm not saying. Okay, enough of that. Let's see how one particular state in Asia dealt with the intrusion of the Europeans, namely Japan. Whereas some African states were open to the influence of Europeans, Japan offers us a good example of what it looks like when a state closes itself off to European influence. Now, when the Dutch and Portuguese first showed up with merchants and missionaries, the Japanese were relatively tolerant of their influence. But as Japanese officials began to observe a growing European and especially Christian influence in their people, they shut it down. They closed off all trade with Europeans and did their best to purge from Japan all European influence in foreign religion. Okay, point number two. Let's turn our attention now to the economic, political, and religious rivalries that spurred all of this imperial expansion on. And just for poops and giggles, let's start with the British. After driving the French out of India during the 7 Years' War, the British gained significant influence in India. At the outset of their time in India, the British basically established your normal average trading posts like they would anywhere else. These trading posts were run by the British East India Company, and under this arrangement they were pretty severely restricted by the Mughal Empire, and therefore they had very little territory to their name. But because of the growing tensions in India between the Muslims and the Hindus, the British were able to play each faction against itself and ended up consolidating a lot of power for itself. Now, how about the Spanish? With the arrival of Columbus and the diseases that he and his men carried, the Spanish eventually toppled the Aztec and Incan empires. By 1521, the colony of New Spain was established on the ashes of the Aztec Empire, and by 1572, they had conquered the Incans as well. But the Spanish had to deal with rivalries of their own, namely with the Portuguese. Spain and Portugal had been fighting bitterly to figure out who was going to gain control of the Americas. And finally, they settled their differences in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And according to this treaty, the Portuguese controlled all the land east of a particular meridian line, which is essentially Brazil, and the Spanish controlled all the land west of the meridian. And there were other rivalries in empire building, like the Dutch and the British in the North American colonies, and the French and the British in Canada, but that should suffice to illustrate the point. Now, as I've mentioned before, all this cross-Atlantic empire building led to some massive changes in the Atlantic Ocean trade. But it's worth mentioning that the Indian Ocean networks were still going strong. And although there was significant change there as well, with huge infusions of European merchants, the Indian Ocean network pretty much absorbed the changes and kept doing its thing. However, there are some changes that I can mention. For example, trade along the Indian Ocean networks had always been maintained by ethnic and religious ties, but when the Portuguese showed up with cannons all over their ships, they used military might to make trade favorable for themselves. Even so, much of the intra-Asian and Asian merchants traded just as they always had. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the third section of this video, namely the labor systems that kept all this imperial expansion running. And the answer is pretty simple. It was largely coerced labor that supported the expansion of empire. And just in case you don't know, coerced means doing doing something against your will. So there's several forms of coerced labor that I should mention. And the first three come to us from our good buddies in Spain. First, they established the hacienda system of labor. The Spanish government granted haciendas, which is to say land holdings, to conquistadors and Spanish nobles who were willing to make the journey across the sea. And once in their possession, that land was under their control to either farm or lease out to other Spaniards of lower classes. And once these people of lower class started working on these lands, it was very unlikely that they would stop working on these lands because of their low wages and the enormous amounts of debt they racked up that they owed to the landowners. And many of these lords grew fabulously wealthy on the backs of their workers, especially when it came to the cultivation of sugarcane. A second coerced labor system from the Spanish was called the encomienda system. And this wasn't so much a land grant like the hacienda system, this was more of a system of labor. The beneficiary of the encomienda system was granted responsibility over a certain number of natives, and the nobles then offered those natives protection and education and Christianity, and in return those natives were to give tribute, most likely in the form of their labor. And this situation was very similar to feudal Europe. It's not that these natives were slaves, but they weren't not slaves either. Third, the Spanish took advantage of an existing labor system in the Americas, namely the Midas system, and they borrowed this system from the Incas. And if you'll remember, under the Incan Empire, the Midas system provided labor for the Incan Empire, and the way it did that was by compelling certain people to work on public projects for a given number of days per year. Now, as you may remember, the Spanish came to the Americas in search of gold. Now, they certainly found some, but not enough to cure them of their desire for wealth. But when they found bukus of silver buried in the American earth, they decided that the Incan forced labor system might serve them well, and so the Spaniards compelled native villages to send a portion of its men to do the dangerous work of silver mining for next to no wages. Now, those three labor systems aren't exactly slavery, but now we're going to talk about a labor system that is exactly slavery. And the word for this is chattel slavery. The word chattel means property. So this is a kind of slavery in which people owned other people as property. So as I've mentioned, some African states had long provided their people as slaves for sale in the Indian Ocean trade, but it was the Atlantic slave trade that really devastated Africa. Okay, now a very significant question arises at this point. Why is it that Europeans targeted Africans for their coerced labor system? I already mentioned that they figured out several ways to get the natives to do the work for them, but according to the Europeans, there were two problems with native workers. First, there just wasn't enough of them after all the European diseases came in and wiped them out. And second, because the natives knew their own land far better than the colonizers did, they were often able to escape. And so suffice to say that the attempt to enslave natives was a large-scale failure. Up in North America, the British tried indentured servitude, which means that people had to work for a certain number of years and then they could go free. But they had trouble with that system too, because once the servants had completed their indenture, they had this rude habit of actually going free. And so chattel slavery solved all of these problems for the Europeans. You see, Africans who arrived as slaves knew the land even less than the Europeans, and since there was no end to their term of servitude, they were in no danger of going free. So, once the Africans were sold to the Europeans, they had to endure the brutal middle passage across the Atlantic. They were stuffed so tightly into the hulls of ships that many of them died from disease and some even from suffocation. And the Atlantic slave trade caused significant consequences in African demographics. As Europeans grew wealthy from agriculture in America, the demand for enslaved workers spiked. And this, as you can imagine, disrupted family organizations. Proportionally, more men were taken than women from these African societies, and that led to the practice of polygyny. And polygyny is just the practice where one man takes several wives. And once the Africans arrived in the Americas on their plantations, they were separated from all those networks of families and community. And if you compare this to the fate of enslaved Africans in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade, you can see the contrast in their fate. In these trade networks, African slaves were more likely to work in seaports or as household servants or even as sailors. And because they often were placed in highly populated areas, they had more occasion to develop communities with other dislocated Africans than did the Africans working in isolation on the American farms. Alright, that's what you need to know about Unit 4.4 in AP World History. If you've been helped by this, then hit that like button and help other people find this video. You want me to keep making these videos for you? It's easy. Just subscribe and I'll keep doing it. And if you join me on Patreon, you can see behind the scenes footage, follow along notes, transcripts for all of this that will help you digest all of this information better. Thanks for watching. Heimler out.